The night was cold and unforgiving. The ruins stretched out around them like the bones of a dead world, broken and silent except for the distant sound of patrols and the mechanical whir of AI drones. Ryan Drake moved like a shadow, his exosuit keeping his steps silent as he scanned the area ahead. Behind him, Zayara followed, her breathing uneven, her movements slow from her injuries. He glanced back at her. Even in the dim light, he could see the tension in her face, the fear she tried so hard to hide. She was a princess, used to commanding armies and being treated like royalty. Now she was a fugitive, hunted by her own people, and her only ally was a human, the very species her empire had tried to crush. "Keep up," Ryan whispered without looking at her. "I'm trying." She snapped back, her voice low but sharp. "Maybe if you weren't dragging me through every pile of rubble." He raised a hand, and she fell silent instantly. Ryan's helmet scanner picked up movement ahead, a Salvoran patrol, their glowing visors cutting through the darkness. He activated his cloaking device, the soft hum barely audible. A second later, they both faded into the shadows. The patrol passed just feet away from them. Zayara held her breath, her body rigid as the soldiers moved by. She'd never felt so vulnerable, not even when her father had betrayed her. The only thing keeping her alive now was this human, and she didn't understand why he hadn't abandoned her yet. When the patrol was gone, Ryan deactivated the cloak and started moving again without a word. Zayara hurried after him, frustration bubbling to the surface. "Why are you doing this?" she demanded in a harsh whisper. "Why save me? I'm your enemy." Ryan didn't stop. "You needed help. That's reason enough." "That's not a reason," she said, her voice rising. "My people would never show you the same mercy." "Yeah, I noticed," he shot back, his tone dry. "Maybe that's the difference between us." They kept moving, slipping through the ruins like ghosts. The silence stretched between them until the sound of approaching drones shattered it. Ryan pushed her against a crumbling wall, his body shielding hers as the drones passed overhead. She could feel the heat of him through his suit, his breath steady and calm. When the drones were gone, he pulled back, and for a moment, their eyes met. She didn't see fear in him, only focus, determination, and something else she couldn't quite name. They moved on, but the tension between them didn't fade. Zayara hated feeling weak, hated relying on anyone, especially a human. But the way Ryan moved, the way he fought, it was unlike anything she'd ever seen. He was precise, brutal, and fearless, and every time danger crept too close, he was there, his weapon ready, his body always positioned between her and whatever threat came their way. They found temporary shelter in the remains of an old structure. Ryan scanned the area while Zayara sank against the wall, exhaustion weighing her down. She watched him in silence, the questions swirling in her mind. He didn't act like the savage her people had always described. He was calm, disciplined, and infuriatingly noble. "Your suit," she said after a while. "It's impressive." He glanced at her, his expression unreadable behind his helmet. "It gets the job done." She hesitated. "Thank you for saving me." The words felt foreign on her tongue. She wasn't used to gratitude, especially not toward a human. Ryan just nodded. "Get some rest. We move at dawn." But dawn never came peacefully. The ambush hit them hard and fast. One moment, they were slipping through the ruins. The next, the air was alive with gunfire and the shriek of drones. Ryan pushed Zayara behind cover, his rifle already blazing. She watched in stunned silence as he fought, moving with lethal efficiency, his every shot finding its mark. But there were too many of them. A drone swooped low, its weapons locking onto her. She raised her arm, but she knew she wouldn't be fast enough. And then Ryan was there. He slammed into her, knocking her aside just as the drone fired. The blast caught him instead, sending him crashing to the ground. "Ryan," she cried, scrambling to his side. He was still alive, but blood seeped from the wound in his side. His breathing was ragged, his face pale beneath his helmet. But even as pain twisted his features, his eyes stayed on her. "Run," he rasped. "Go. I'm not leaving you." She snapped, her hands already working to stop the bleeding. The battle faded around them as she focused on him. The enemy would find them soon. She knew that. But she couldn't leave him behind. Not after everything he'd done. She managed to stabilize him just enough to move. Half carrying, half dragging him, she led them into the shadows, her heart pounding with fear and fury. The drones circled overhead, but the ruins gave them cover. After what felt like an eternity, she found a cave. Dark, hidden, and safe. Inside, she eased him to the ground and stripped away the damaged parts of his suit. His wound was bad, deep and ugly. But he was still alive. And as she worked, something shifted inside her. She'd been raised to see humans as animals, but this man had risked everything for her. He'd taken a hit meant for her. "Why?" she whispered, her hands trembling as she bandaged his side. "Why did you do that?" Ryan's eyes opened, and for the first time, his voice softened. "Because no one deserves to be left behind." She didn't know what to say to that. The war, their differences, none of it mattered in this moment. All she knew was that for the first time in her life, someone had put her life above their own, and that someone was a human. As the night stretched on, the sound of patrols faded, and the only thing left was the quiet of the cave and the steady rhythm of his breathing. She stayed close, her eyes never leaving his face, and when sleep finally claimed her, it was with the warmth of his hand resting lightly against hers. For the first time in a long time, she felt safe. The cave's stillness didn't last long. The distant sound of patrols and the cold wind slipping through the cracks reminded them that safety was temporary. Ryan stirred, his face pale but his eyes sharp as they fluttered open. He tried to sit up, but pain rippled through his body, and Ziara's hand pushed him gently back down. "Don't," she said softly. "You're not ready." "I don't have time to rest," Ryan muttered, but his body betrayed him, too weak to fight her hold. He hated feeling vulnerable, hated that she had to care for him, but the warmth in her touch and the concern in her eyes eased some of that frustration. "We're not going anywhere until you can stand without falling over," she insisted, her voice firm. He knew she was right, but every second they stayed put increased the risk of discovery. Still, his body wouldn't let him argue. So he closed his eyes again, letting exhaustion take him for just a little while longer. When he woke, the cave was darker and the air colder. Ziara sat at the entrance, her back to him, her form outlined by the faint glow of the distant stars. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked, his voice rough. She didn't turn. "I'm not used to this. Running, hiding, depending on someone else to stay alive." There was bitterness in her tone, but also fear. "I was a princess, untouchable. Now I'm a target." Ryan sat up slowly, wincing but managing to stay upright. "Your father did this to you?" he asked. She nodded. "I tried to stop him, his war, his madness. He saw that as treason. Now I'm nothing more than an inconvenience he once eliminated." For a moment, the silence stretched between them. Then she turned to face him, her eyes searching his. "Why did you save me, Ryan? Why risk your life for someone who's supposed to be your enemy?" He held her gaze, his voice soft but steady. "Because no one deserves to be abandoned." The words hit her harder than she expected. Abandoned. It was exactly how she felt. Cast aside, hunted, alone. And this human, who had every reason to leave her behind, had done the opposite. He had fought for her, bled for her, protected her. "Thank you," she whispered, the words foreign on her tongue but sincere. He only nodded, but the warmth in his eyes said more than his words ever could. Morning came too soon, and with it, danger. Ryan was still weak, But there was no more time to rest. The sound of approaching drones forced them to move, slipping out of the cave and into the ruins once more. The pursuit was relentless. The Voran soldiers tracked them with a brutal efficiency, their drones sweeping the area with heat sensors and advanced scanners. Ryan's exosuit cloaked them as best it could, but the energy reserves were running low. Every step felt more desperate. They made their way toward an old communications outpost, their best shot at calling for extraction. But the closer they got, the tighter the enemy net became. At one point, they were forced to take cover in the remains of a collapsed building, as a squad of soldiers passed by just feet away. Ryan held his breath, his weapon ready, while Ziara's hand gripped his arm, her fingers trembling. When the soldiers finally moved on, she exhaled shakily. "How do you do this?" she whispered. "How do humans keep fighting when the odds are so impossible?" He glanced at her, his expression calm despite the danger. "Because giving up isn't an option." She stared at him, trying to understand that kind of resilience. Her people valued strength, but when defeat seemed certain, they withdrew. Humans didn't. They kept fighting, even when survival seemed hopeless, and Ryan embodied that spirit more than anyone she'd ever known. The outpost was in sight when the ambush hit. Drones screamed overhead, and soldiers emerged from the shadows, weapons blazing. Ryan pushed Ziara behind cover and returned fire, his rifle cutting down the first wave. But there were too many. "Stay down," he barked, moving with deadly efficiency. He fired, moved, fired again, never staying in one place long enough to become a target. Ziara watched in awe and fear. A drone locked onto their position, and before she could react, it fired. The blast struck the ground near them, sending her sprawling. Pain lanced through her leg, and she cried out. Ryan was there in an instant, dragging her to safety. His eyes flicked to her injury, his jaw tightening. "Can you walk?" I think so." "Then we move. Now." They ran, the enemy close behind. Ryan's exosuit took several hits, sparks flying from damaged circuits. But he never slowed. When they reached the outpost, he sealed the door behind them and activated the emergency beacon. "They'll find us here," Ziara said, her voice shaking. "We're trapped." "Not yet," Ryan replied. "We just need to hold out until extraction." But the odds weren't in their favor. The enemy surrounded the outpost, and the building shook under the barrage of their attack. Ryan kept firing, but the ammo was running low, and his injuries were slowing him down. Ziara watched him, her heart pounding. She had never felt this kind of fear, not for herself, but for someone else. She couldn't lose him. Not now. When the wall finally gave way, and the soldiers poured in, she didn't hesitate. She grabbed Ryan's sidearm and fired, the weapon heavy and unfamiliar in her hands. But she didn't stop. Together, they fought side by side, their movements perfectly in sync, and for the first time in her life, she felt something more powerful than fear. She felt hope. The extraction ship arrived just as their defenses crumbled. The roar of its engines drowned out the battle, and Ryan dragged her toward the ramp, his body shielding hers until the very last second. As they lifted off, the ground below erupting in fire and chaos, Ziara collapsed against him, her breath ragged. You kept me alive," she whispered. "Promised I would," he replied, his voice soft but fierce. And as the ship carried them away from the battlefield, she knew something inside her had changed. For the first time, an enemy felt like a protector, and she wasn't ready to let him go. The cold metal walls of the extraction ship hummed with energy as it sped toward the rendezvous point, but there was no time to rest. Ryan's distress beacon had finally gotten a response, but it hadn't just been picked up by humans. The Voran forces had intercepted it too. "They're coming," Ryan said grimly, his fingers tightening around his rifle. His face was pale from blood loss, but his eyes were sharp and focused. He was a soldier, the kind that kept fighting no matter the odds. Sayara stood beside him, her own wounds forgotten in the rush of fear and adrenaline. "We won't make it to your reinforcements," she said quietly. "We will," Ryan said, but even he knew the truth. The Exalvoran Empire would throw everything they had at this ship. They couldn't allow their rogue princess to escape, and they definitely wouldn't let a human soldier walk away with her. The first attack came without warning. The ship jolted violently as enemy fire struck its hull. Sirens blared, and the pilot's frantic voice echoed through the comms. "We've got incoming. Brace yourselves." The ramp hissed open, and Ryan moved instantly. "Stay behind me," he ordered, his voice leaving no room for argument. But Sayara wasn't about to hide. Not anymore. "I'm fighting," she said, grabbing a weapon from the wall. "I'm not going to let them take me." Ryan glanced at her, and in that moment, he saw the fear in her eyes. But there was something else there too. Determination. Courage. He nodded. "Stay close." The first wave of Salvoran assassins hit the ship like a storm. They were fast, their armor sleek and advanced, their weapons spitting blue plasma. Ryan moved like a force of nature, his exosuit enhancing his speed and strength, his rifle dropping enemies with ruthless precision. Sayara fought beside him, her strikes fierce but controlled. She wasn't a soldier, not like him. But she was fast, and her instincts were sharp. Together, they cut through the attackers, their movements perfectly in sync. "Left," Ryan shouted, spinning to take down a drone. Sayara pivoted, firing at an assassin charging toward them. The enemy fell, and for a heartbeat, there was silence. Then the second wave came. The ship shuddered, and the lights flickered. More drones poured in, and this time they were accompanied by Xalvoran elites, heavily armored, their weapons crackling with energy. "We can't hold them off," Sayara shouted, her voice ragged. Ryan's mind worked fast. He reached into his belt and pulled out a small, sleek device, a personal cloaking unit. He shoved it into her hand. "Take this." "What?" "No. Take it," he snapped. "It'll buy you time. Get to the escape pod. I'll hold them off. I'm not leaving you." "Sayara." "No." She cut him off, her eyes blazing. "I trust you more than my own kind. I'm not leaving you behind." For a second, they just stared at each other. And in that moment, words weren't needed. The bond between them had grown stronger than either of them realized. The ship rocked violently, and the sound of more enemy forces closing in snapped them back to the fight. Ryan gritted his teeth. "Then we make our stand. Together." The battle became a blur. Ryan moved like a man possessed, his body pushed beyond its limits. Sayara stayed at his side, her aim steady even as exhaustion threatened to take over. The Exalvoran forces kept coming, relentless, overwhelming. And then, just when it seemed like they couldn't hold out any longer, the human reinforcements arrived. The sky above the battlefield erupted in fire as human ships descended, their cannons tearing through the enemy lines. Drop pods slammed into the ground, and armored soldiers poured out, their weapons blazing. But the fight wasn't over. Not yet. The Exalvoran commander, a towering figure in obsidian armor, entered the fray. His eyes locked onto Sayara with cold fury. "Traitor," he spat. "You disgrace our bloodline." "She's not going anywhere with you," Ryan growled, stepping in front of her. The commander sneered. "You think a human can protect her?" He raised his weapon, but Ryan was faster. The fight was brutal. The commander was strong, faster than any enemy Ryan had faced before. But Ryan had something the Exalvoran never understood: determination. He fought with everything he had, every strike driven by the need to keep Sayara safe. In the end, it was Sayara who delivered the final blow. As the commander raised his weapon for a killing strike, she fired. And the shot hit true. The commander fell, and with him, the tide of the battle turned. The remaining Salvoran forces scattered, their will broken. When the last of the enemies fell, Ryan finally let himself collapse. The pain, the exhaustion, it all caught up to him at once. Ziyara was there in an instant, her arms wrapping around him. "Stay with me," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Please." "I'm not going anywhere," he murmured, his eyes closing. And as the human ships carried them to safety, she held him tight, knowing that, for the first time, she wasn't alone. The air was thick with tension as the distant sound of approaching ships rumbled through the ruined landscape. Ryan Drake stood at the edge of the crumbling outpost, his rifle gripped tightly in his hands. The distress beacon he'd sent out hours ago had finally been answered, but not just by humans. The XL Vorin had intercepted the signal too. Beside him, Princess Ziyara shifted uneasily, her sharp violet eyes scanning the horizon. The heir to the XL Vorin throne, now a fugitive, looked more like a warrior than royalty. Her once elegant armor was battered and scorched, her face smeared with dirt and streaked with dried blood. Yet even in this broken state, there was a fierceness in her that Ryan couldn't ignore. "They're coming," Ryan said, his voice calm but tense. Ziyara nodded, but there was a flicker of doubt in her eyes. "We won't make it, will we?" Ryan didn't answer immediately. He didn't lie. He'd faced impossible odds before, but this was something else. "We'll fight," he said finally. "That's all we can do." The first attack hit like a hammer. The outpost shuddered under the impact of orbital strikes, and the sky erupted with fire. Enemy dropships descended like predatory birds, and the ground quaked as their forces poured out. Ryan moved instantly. "Stay behind me," he ordered, his voice sharp and commanding. But Ziyara wasn't about to hide. "I'm not running," she snapped, snatching a weapon from a fallen soldier. "Not anymore." There was no time to argue. The XL Vorin assassins were already closing in. The first wave came fast. Sleek, armored figures moving with inhuman speed and precision. Plasma bolts hissed through the air, and the air filled with the acrid scent of burning metal. Ryan fought like a man possessed. His exosuit enhanced his strength and reflexes, turning him into a blur of deadly efficiency. Every shot he fired found its mark. Every movement was precise and brutal. Ziyara held her own. She wasn't as experienced, but she was fast and fierce, her strikes driven by desperation and anger. Together, they were a storm, two warriors from different worlds, fighting as one. But the enemy kept coming. Drones swarmed overhead, raining fire from above. Ryan took out 3 with a single burst, but more replaced them almost instantly. The ground forces pressed in, their weapons cutting off any hope of escape. A blast knocked Ryan off his feet, and he hit the ground hard. Before he could recover, an assassin loomed over him, blade raised. And then Ziyara was there. She fired without hesitation, the shot burning through the assassin's chest. The enemy fell, and she was already helping Ryan to his feet. "You okay?" she asked, breathless. "Yeah," he managed, though pain lanced through his side. "Thanks." The battle raged on. For every enemy they took down, 2 more replaced them. Their ammo ran low, their bodies ached, but they kept fighting. There was no other choice. When the XL Vorin elites arrived, Ryan knew they were out of time. He'd faced these warriors before, heavily armored, brutally efficient, and nearly unstoppable. The ground shook beneath their advance, and their weapons glowed with lethal energy. "We can't hold them," Ziyara said, her voice tight with fear. Ryan's mind raced. He reached into his belt and pulled out a small, sleek device, a personal cloaking unit. He pressed it into her hand. "Take this," he said. "No," she protested immediately. "I'm not leaving you." "Take it," he snapped. "It'll buy you time. Get to the escape pod. I'll hold them off." "I'm not leaving you behind." Her voice broke, and for the first time, Ryan saw the fear beneath her defiance. He softened. "Ziyara." "No," she said again, quieter this time. "I trust you more than my own kind. I won't leave you." For a moment, The battle faded away. They stood there, two enemies turned allies, bound by something neither of them fully understood. Then the ground exploded around them, and reality crashed back in. The final stand began. They fought side by side, their movements perfectly in sync. Ryan's rifle spat fire, cutting down enemies with relentless precision. Zayara moved like a dancer, her strikes swift and deadly. The Exalvoran elites pressed them hard, but they didn't break. But they were running out of time. Ryan's exosuit was damaged, his movements slowing. Zayara's weapon overheated, and she resorted to a blade. They were cornered, outnumbered, and exhausted. Then the sky split open. Human dropships descended in a storm of fire and thunder. The ground trembled as reinforcements poured in, their weapons blazing. The Exalvoran forces faltered, but they didn't retreat. The enemy commander arrived. He was massive, towering over the battlefield in obsidian armor. His eyes locked onto Zayara with cold fury. "Traitor," he hissed. "You disgrace our bloodline." Ryan stepped forward. "She's not going anywhere with you." The commander sneered. "You think a human can protect her?" Ryan didn't answer. He just raised his weapon. The fight was brutal. The commander was fast, faster than anything Ryan had ever faced. Every strike was a killing blow, every movement calculated and deadly. Ryan's exosuit was damaged, his strength failing. But he didn't back down. Zayara fought too, but even together, they were outmatched. The commander's blade caught Ryan's side, and he fell with a choked cry. "No," Zayara screamed. The commander raised his weapon for the final strike. And then Zayara fired. The shot hit true. The commander staggered, and she didn't stop, firing again and again until he finally fell. Silence fell over the battlefield. The Exalvoran forces, seeing their leader dead, broke and scattered. It was over. Zayara dropped her weapon and rushed to Ryan's side. He was breathing, but barely. "Stay with me," she whispered, her voice shaking. "Please." "I'm not going anywhere," he murmured, his eyes closing. And as the human ships carried them to safety, she held him tight, knowing that for the first time, she wasn't alone. The war was far from over, but for the first time in what felt like an eternity, there was quiet. The hidden human outpost was carved into the side of a jagged cliff, overlooking an alien landscape bathed in the soft hues of a strange sunset. The sky was streaked with gold and violet, colors that felt almost dreamlike after so much fire and blood. Ryan Drake stood at the edge of the overlook, his arms crossed over his chest as he watched the horizon. His body still ached from the fight, the wounds stitched and patched up, but the pain lingered. Yet that wasn't what kept him awake. His mind was on her. Zayara. She was safe now, as safe as she could be, considering half her empire wanted her dead. The other half would probably kill her just for aligning with a human, and yet she had chosen to trust him. The thought stirred something deep inside him, something he hadn't allowed himself to acknowledge. Not until now. The soft sound of footsteps behind him made him turn. Zayara stood there, silhouetted against the alien sunset. She had cleaned up since the battle, her dark hair brushed out, her violet skin glowing softly in the fading light. She wasn't wearing her battle armor anymore. Instead, she wore a simple tunic and leggings borrowed from the human supply cache, and somehow, even in the worn fabric, she looked regal. "You shouldn't be out here," she said softly, stepping closer. "Your wounds." "I'm fine," Ryan cut her off, but his voice was gentler than his words. Zayara didn't look convinced, but she didn't press the issue. Instead, she stood beside him, her eyes fixed on the horizon. They stood in silence for a while, the air between them heavy with things unsaid. Finally, she spoke. "I never thanked you." Ryan glanced at her. "You don't have to." "But I do," she insisted, turning to face him fully. "You saved my life. More than once. You protected me when you had no reason to. And you stayed when you could have left me behind." Her voice softened. "Why?" Ryan held her gaze. "Because no one deserves to be abandoned." The words hung between them, and something shifted in her expression. A crack in the carefully controlled mask she always wore. "You make it sound so simple," she whispered. "But it's not. Not for my people. Strength is everything. Mercy is weakness. And trust." She shook her head. "Trust gets you killed." "Not always," Ryan said quietly. She met his eyes then, and for the first time, there was no distance between them. No war. No enemy lines. Just two people who had fought, bled, and survived together. "I owe you everything," she said, her voice trembling. "My life, my freedom, my trust. And I want to give you something in return." He started to shake his head, but she stepped closer, her fingers brushing against his hand. The touch was light, but it sent a jolt through him. "Not out of obligation," she said softly. "Because I want to." The air grew heavier, charged with something electric and undeniable. Ryan's heart pounded, his body warring with his mind. He wanted her, more than he'd ever wanted anything, but there was still that sliver of doubt. "Ziyara." His voice was rough. "Are you sure?" She answered by closing the distance between them, her hands sliding up his arms, her body pressing against his. "Yes." And then she kissed him. The world fell away. There was no war, no enemies, no fear. Just the warmth of her lips, the softness of her touch. He wrapped his arms around her, pulling her closer, and she melted into him like she longed there. The kiss deepened, grew more desperate. Ryan's control slipped, and he didn't care. They stumbled back into the shelter of the outpost, their hands exploring, their breath ragged. The room they found was small and dimly lit, but none of that mattered. All that mattered was the way she looked at him, like he was the only thing keeping her grounded, like she needed him as much as he needed her. Their clothes fell away, and there was no hesitation, no second-guessing. Just heat and want, and the quiet sound of their names whispered in the dark. When it was over, they lay tangled together beneath the thin blankets, her head resting on his chest. The steady rhythm of his heartbeat was the most comforting sound she'd ever known. "Ryan," her voice was barely a whisper. "Yeah, what happens now?" He was quiet for a long time, his fingers tracing lazy circles on her back. "We fight," he said finally. "We find a way to end this war. And we survive." She lifted her head to look at him. "And after?" He brushed a strand of hair from her face, his thumb lingering on her cheek. "We figure it out. Together." For the first time in a long time, Ziyara smiled. And for that moment, the war felt a little farther away.